thanks for joining today's session on the Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure. And we're going to talk about the landing zone. And we have the pleasure to be here today with David from HashiCorp. Hello, David.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, David. Do you want to give us a quick introduction on what you're doing at HashiCorp?
So I'm lucky enough to work across the APJ region with all of our partners and our cloud providers, looking at how we can come together to create unique and interesting solutions.
Very nice. So thanks for joining us today, for being on this show. Real pleasure to be with you today and to share about Cloud Adoption Framework and Cloud Operating Model and discuss about Landing Zone and HashiCorp and Microsoft Azure together. So this is a super interactive session. So we're going to talk about many stuff at any time. Feel free to reach out to us. You have the Contact Us button. So don't hesitate. Super happy to take your question as we speak. So let's get started. You probably heard about the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. It is the one Microsoft stop for our cloud adoption. So we're going from the strategy to the planning to the getting ready phases, and then guiding you through the adoption via first the either migrate or modernizing the workload, and then innovate, leveraging all the possibilities of cloud, and at all of those stages, taking into consideration the governance and the management. So all of that is documented under CAF, and you can find everything at aka.ms/CAF, CAF, and a lot of documentation there, including our approach for the Cloud Adoption Framework landing zones for Terraform. Really, there's one aspect that we want to take into consideration is first, what is a landing zone? So effectively, a landing zone is a set of infrastructure components that are needed to deploy an application. So everything you need to have an application ready on your cloud infrastructure, that's basically a landing zone. That's the definition, and that's the take we are having with landing zone. So if we say landing zone, very first thing that comes to mind is the infrastructure as code concept, where you can basically change the way you do operations, change the way you do deployment of things in your environment, and you can stand environment super fast in cloud. You can remove the human element, the forget one step in the procedure, no more anything like that. It's all in the code. So as a result, you have much more predictable operations, much more predictable deployment, and much more improved efficiency into the environment. So cheaper operations at the end. And this comes with this concept that you have your code and your infrastructure, which is coded. But of course, along with that, you have the environment, which is basically a set of variables. So production is described by a set of variables. UAT is described by a set of variables, etc., etc. So everything being super version control, so that allows you really to have reproducible and things that you can be in control. And since it's code, you can apply all the techniques of code, which is test-driven development, validating pull request inside a test environment before it's hitting production. So much more quality at the end of the day in the releases of what we do.
Just an interesting question. How do you see infrastructure as code allowing developers and builders to actually make changes for their business faster? How do you see that working, leveraging these infrastructure as code philosophy?
Hey, David, that's a super good question. Actually, I think the term infrastructure as code is a little bit limiting our mindset. So I don't really like it that much, but honestly, that's deploying everything as code, I should say. So really, you can deploy the foundation layers of your environment. And here you see the AKS environment. I have my Kubernetes environment, but you can go even further than that. And you'll see later with our layered approach for landing zone is we can really deploy applications, consider everything that is required by an application and even an application. So that's really what it creates at the end of the day. And also what you can do out of that is create enterprise architecture patterns that you can reuse across organization, across different parts of the organization. So actually, yes, it definitely will help for the applications, David. And thanks for the question.
No problems.
And basically, Microsoft Azure is an open cloud. So whichever is your choice in terms of automation, you would expect Microsoft to give you the best guidance and the best tools and the best archetypes on PowerShell, ARM template, and CLI. There's also many options that we're happy to support. And let's say you can do everything with Puppet, with Python even, that's a possibility. But what we found when we're doing infrastructure as code, it's important to have an inclusive declarative language. We find it's really, really nice to be able to gather people with different backgrounds with a declarative language. And as such, we've seen a lot of people being successful with Terraform. And as part of Cloud Adoption Framework, yes, we're giving you guidance and archetypes that you can use with Terraform. So basically, it started a couple of months ago when we started to give those archetypes. So it's all on GitHub. It's open source. It's community driven. So you can open an issue, open a pull request, and that's how we manage the environment. It's of course part of Cloud Adoption Framework, and it is basically what we want to achieve is a lower entry cost to infrastructure as code. We know that when we're starting an infrastructure as code project, there's a lot of things to set up. There's a lot of things to think about, the project, the structure of the code, one repo, multi-repo, all of the stuff. So we want to give you some of our best practices, or at least field proven practices that we've seen customers successful with. And of course, we want to have that enterprise grade approach. So not only making a bunch of script working, but having something which is ready to hit production grade that you can basically leverage, and it will accelerate your deployment. So in a sense, kind of a best practices in a box. But of course, that's just the foundation, and then it's you to implement the additional, I would say, best practices.
You talk about that enterprise grade approach. What do you distinguish that difference between the open source and supporting the open source community and the enterprise grade? I know from our perspective, we have a very clear understanding around what that means, having both, a community product and an enterprise product. But it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts from what the customers have told you around what they need from an enterprise grade solution.
So again, David, super happy to have this question, and this is really something that we're seeing a lot from our customer. And there's two approach on that. They're saying first, it's good if I can get started with the knowledge of the community, and then there's a bit of maybe things I need to do on my private environment, because I need to discover, I need to create things maybe that are very specific to my environment, and that's totally fine. But still leveraging the components that are present on the open source. So this is one thing on our approach, which we are very clear, which is at the beginning of the project, maybe what you're going to see is cloning all the repo that we have from the Cloud Adoption Framework landing zone, work on it in private, but you only do that by forking the repo, actually more than cloning. So you're able to keep this link with the repo, you're able to basically either submit back to the community the development that you have done on a particular module, or let's say you haven't had time to, and you want this brand new feature that has been introduced in the community version. So you're able to sync back. So with the fork and the link you have kept with the upstream environment, then you're still able to keep the history and resync back with that in your environment. And then, of course, it includes all the testing and all the validations that you have. But this is really an important aspect, keeping the link with the innovation and leveraging enterprise in the enterprise, all the advantages of open source. That's really something that we clearly see now. And if you go on the repo, you see people contributing, might be Microsoft people, might be partners, might be customer. And this is really the right approach that we want to see.
Awesome.
And actually, what are those components that we published? So if you see, it's all available on aka.ms/TF landing zones. And you see there's a set of Terraform artifacts. So pure Terraform artifacts, those are what we call the Terraform modules and the landing zones. And the module is really the fundamental element, like deploying a virtual network, but with a twist. Right, because you probably find tons of module how to create a virtual network on Azure. That's totally fine. But how do you do that in enterprise environment? Well, you know that you will need to have network security group. You need to have logging for those network security group. You want to have high visibility on the logs and long-term retention. You want to leverage network flow logs to see graphical view on all the diagram and all the flow goings into your environment. So that's kind of forcing all of those best practices to be present. This is a module. On the other side of the complexity chain, it's the landing zone, which is the service composition, most complex construct, where we are going to leverage basically a set of modules put together to deliver a service. Like we see here in a very small picture, for instance, in a hub and spoke network environment, where I have my different virtual network, my firewall, my network security group, and all of that with the corporate login for log analytics, the long-term retention of the logs for the security logs. So those are the two main pure Terraform artifacts code. And what we found is also that we need to have a Terraform CAF provider. And right now what we're doing in this CAF provider is actually interesting. We manage it for mainly using naming convention. So automatically generating the name based on the context, based on the CAF recommendation, or based on additional would be your own naming convention. That's something that we provide. And all of that, of course, all those elements are open source. And last but not least, I think what we found is quite challenging to manage scale. You're talking about enterprise open source, David, but really one of the challenges is how do I make sure that all of my developers work with the same development environment first? And it's not only just about having the latest version of Terraform on your laptop. It's Terraform plus, all my code quality tools like my TF-Sync, my TF-Lint, all of the things that I need to have to manage the quality of my code. So this is why we have Rover, which is actually a Docker container, as you can guess by the icon, and is really putting all of those tools together in a released version, and it can be propagated on all the developers, whether they're using Windows, Linux, Mac. It's all the same, and the bonus point of that, it's also the same tool that we're going to run in CI/CD pipeline. So if you integrate that into any CI/CD favorite tool, you can use GitHub Action, DevOps, or any other tool, then that's the same thing. You just have to basically connect Rover to your CI/CD environment, and it's super simple. And also, on top of that, what we provide is a set of technology to manage the different layer. So what we found very important, David, when we were creating this enterprise approach of landing zone, is to have kind of a structure, have kind of a model to refer to, because infrastructure as code, there would be a lot of code, there will be a lot of environment. So how do we manage this complexity, and how do we have a methodical approach on that? So if you see at the model that we have used for that, it's defining first the level 0. What we call the level 0 is really the fundamental operations. So for instance, multi-subscription management, state management, service principal management. So there's a little bit of all of this complex stuff that we need to solve in order to, let's say, scale and make things happen in the enterprise. And then we have a set of category of landing zone. For instance, level 1 ensures you of the security and compliance. So the RBAC policy, the monitoring, the SIEM collector log, all of these elements. And on top of that, you have the hub and spoke network with the shared services or any type of network topology. On top of that, you have the application landing zone, so my AKS cluster, my web application firewall, etc. And on top of that, you have your layer 4 or level 4 landing zones, which is really the application landing zone. So at this level, it's a little bit of Terraform, but it's a little bit of something else as well. It's probably my Spring Boot microservices framework, my code of my application, and a bit of Terraform to describe how does it run onto my underlying layers. So the reason why we have these different layers is, as you can guess, first thing is the blast radius control, right? Nobody wants to have a whole enterprise into, of course, a one TF file, and if someone has an issue with the TF state, then the whole enterprise is blocked, right? And it's also segregation of duty, because you don't want a developer that is developing a level 4 landing zone to have the possibility to see, manage, or read or write the configuration of the fundamentals of auditing and complying. But you might have to read down level of the state of one environment. For instance, at level 2, you see I'm deploying my virtual network. But I'm going to read what's present at level 1 because I want to know where should I deploy my logs for my network. So you see that's this layer approach where I'm going to assume some services from the level under me. I'm going to be able to read some information from the Terraform state, but I'm not going to be able to write it. So this is how we do the composition of complex environment. So this is, key when you're in enterprise. You want to empower the people. You want to put some guardrails and some controls, but still you want to have autonomy and things happening. And this is by this layering and by this separation of the TF state that we are ensuring those stuff.
And does that align with? Obviously, we have the concept of workspaces and that separation of duty. How do you see customers deploying that separation? Are they doing it around like a job function? Are they doing it around a line of business? How do you see them interacting with those different layers and that separation of duty?
Actually, I would say what we see is a bit of both. To be frank, there's still very often this, classic segregation that we had, and it tends to be more and more blur. But we still have the networking team, the storage team, the compute team, and the app team, and that's still very, very present. Now, it seems to be that it's more and more integrated, and that's actually the purpose of those landing zone and all the DevOps mechanisms that we put in place here. It's really helping people collaborate. So that's really what we see at the command standpoint and how it evolves slowly. And actually, it can be declined into different configuration into the environment. It could be, for instance, a specific configuration repository for different teams. So sometimes we have people that manage the Git repository for the network configuration into a separate Git repository from the other layers. And that's totally fine. Ultimately, that's the pipeline is going to pick the data and enforce it into the environment. But you see, there's 50 shades of configuration repo and probably much more that you can find. But that's really being able to customize and manage this complexity and flexibility that we're offering with those layers. And talking about layers, I think there is one which is very difficult, which is the fundamental layer. It's always the lower layers that are difficult to ensure. But so what we provide to ensure that, if you see at the level 0, so level 0 contains many stuff. It contains, as we mentioned, the secret rotation. It contains multi-subscription management routine, but it also fundamentally contains the basics of storage of the state, the Terraform state. We want to store the state securely and collaborate on the state. So we have two things that we provide out of the box. One is the very simple, simpler stuff, which is the open source light, which is just, hey, I'm applying in my state, I'm uploading into an Azure storage account, and that works. That's totally fine. There's another one which is made for collaboration and open source collaboration using Azure DevOps or GitHub Action. And this is the open source that creates a little bit more stuff on the deployment agent. And there are two other stuff that we're working on right now, which is actually to leverage TFC and TFE. So David, you're going to go through the details of Terraform Cloud, the TFC, and Terraform Enterprise in a couple of minutes. But this is something that HashiCorp and Microsoft were delivering together here to provide the same experience, the same segregation, and the same methodology, whichever technology you choose. We're all about giving options and the best value in each solution.
Yeah, thank you, Arnaud. So I think the layering approach you talked about fits in very well with our move, where we see that distinction between the open source community, which is the individual, and as we move into solving for the enterprise and around collaboration. And in that transition from individual practitioners or small group, very focused group, and then trying to disperse that into a larger scale, we talk about this micro infrastructure and how to actually as to that question that I asked around, and interesting to see how your customers will do it, we see the same thing where our customers have these different organizational work groups that they need to control their functions. People have been working in these groups for a long period of time. They've established whole workflows around them. And so how do you tie these elements together to create and deploy that infrastructure as code philosophy that you mentioned at the start, and also to have that reduced blast zone and the control needed around each one of those. And so one of the great things with Terraform Cloud and Terraform Enterprise is that the workspace concepts allows individual ties into a particular version control system. And from there, you can run a particular either module or series of modules or a particular code set that deploys an outcome. And then you can tie those workspaces together. So information from one workspace can either trigger and kick on a run in another, or it can actually pull information and a data set out of that to actually interlock. And when you see these elements then being put together, you can see how that traditional monolith of infrastructure is broken down into those micro elements. And through those, you can also apply one of our Sentinel policies, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but goes into more depth. That is fundamentally around how you can apply policy as code. So not just having infrastructure as code, but also policy.
Very nice. So David, just to link with the approach. So if you see here the workspace, so for instance, a workspace would be a layer within one of our layer, right? Is this?
That's correct.
Yep.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So you could, if you wanted to, you could pull those individual layers around, and then with the new features in Terraform Cloud, for example, you can set RBAC and permissions around those individual layers. So in terms of being able to define those layers, as you rightly said, at layer 4, where you have those infrastructure application level, you may not want the infrastructure team being able to see that, and so you can set policy and control around that. So there's that distinction between function and role.
Very nice. Cool. So that's a little bit of zooming onto this diagram. You mentioned about Sentinel. So Sentinel is one feature that allows you to do like pre-apply policies. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Sentinel is taking that concept of infrastructure as code and applying it to how do you do governance and compliance. And so the key thing with governance and compliance is there are known criteria, and so Sentinel policies can be written to meet your company policies or regulatory, PCI, HIPAA, any of those, and you can write those policies. We've also taken a bunch of best practices, so we used the CIS standard and created some fundamental libraries that allow you to apply best practices to that. So things such as are my VMs open on any port, for example, or any of those kind of infrastructure elements that you would want to baseline your security around. And so before you actually apply your infrastructure, the Sentinel policy will run, check those, and so instead of having to actually go back and retro scan or retrofit security into your infrastructure, you can actually benchmark it before you deploy it. And I think one of these things, these things and the ability to control and separate the duties, being able to separate those layers, for your example in deploying landing zones, what we're really talking about is building a model of trust. And so all of these things come together to allow you to actually trust in your automation process. So what we're trying to get to is a point where, and we see it with maturity of our customers as they work through our cloud operating model, is that to start with, they start very simply. It's very hands-on. People see the runs, they are physically involved in it. But as they start to build and scale that out, and how do I get that to scale for my enterprise? So they have to build in, and you touched on it, pipelining, they have to touch in test processes, they have to build in elements like Sentinel and governance and compliance controls, and even workflow integration into ServiceNow or ITIL tool that allow them to then trust that deployment. So it then takes the responsibility of having to actually oversee it and turns it over to a simple click and deploy.
Yeah, so we've seen the technical bits, but ultimately that's about workflows.
Yeah, and this was a really big kind of eye opener for me when I came to HashiCorp. You know, I've been very focused in the cloud business for a few years. I've been working with lots of different cloud providers and working in different ISVs. But all of the time, the language that we'd use and all of the thinking had always been around the workload. And so it's very much around how do we drive this workload which creates an outcome. But when you take a step back from that, and HashiCorp, as I say, in their cloud operating model, really thought about how do you achieve a model that works across. And so they've taken this step back and thought about it from the workflow. And the workflow is then can be across any cloud, could be across hybrid cloud, can be across containers and multi-different environments. And the workloads that you are then creating, which can be individual workspaces, or in your case, the individual layers of a landing zone, those go to actually create that workflow which creates the outcome. And the outcome is then a business outcome, whether that's the full deployment of an app or whether it's an integration of a new part of an app into an existing infrastructure component. But it's around understanding the workflow and what is needed in that flow to actually get the outcome you want.
Very nice. So which tools do we use for that? What are the options? I talked a little bit about that before, but which ones?
Yeah, so the way that HashiCorp is focused is obviously we have a fantastic open source community, and that drives, to your point, it drives knowledge, it drives a lot of understanding and in-depth knowledge within the product itself. And they contribute a whole heap back into that development cycle. But as we start to move into enterprise and into larger scale, so that practitioner component, which is very much usually focused around the individual or a very small team, we start to need to now collaborate through multiple teams, maybe even between multiple parts of the business, separate business units. And so as we start to get into those areas, we need to then start accepting and meeting those challenges. And so how do we manage that state? How do we keep control of it? How do we provide enterprise-grade control like RBAC and being able to put different version controlling around it? And so that's where Terraform Cloud for Business comes into play, and also Terraform Enterprise. So depending on your requirements around governance and compliance, on the speed and maturity of your business and the volume of changes that you're making, you can then tailor the options either around Terraform Cloud or Terraform Enterprise to meet the best cost performance for the best outcome that you need in terms of performance and concurrent runs and infrastructure changes. So the tools are there to offer up as much flexibility and even start from an open source to experiment and then work through to meeting your enterprise challenges.
Very nice. And whichever option you're choosing, as we were talking previously, we're working together on providing the landing zone, working on all of those options. And actually, we're going to show that in a demo in a couple of minutes.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's it's about that collaboration. We as we start to work together, we start to collaborate. We start to provide all of the elements that customers need as they move through that journey. And this is just part of that maturity journey for us.
Excellent.
So we touched on Sentinel a little bit. So I just wanted to go into it a little bit more for those that are probably a little bit more familiar with Terraform themselves. In the process of creating a Terraform run, there are some very defined stages. So you pull from your version control, you have your code that is written, that is your outcome. So in your case, for example, you have those really awesome landing zones that build out all of those different components and networking elements. Then you run a plan to make sure that actually it does what you think it does on the label and see what it will create. And then usually from that stage, you then go into applying your Terraform and actually running that against the APIs and building your infrastructure. Where Sentinel comes in is a mechanism to breach between those 2 points. And in that point, before you actually apply and can run your infrastructure, it will actually go and then check a whole bunch of those policy components. And whether you're using our CIS library or whether you're writing your own, you can really start to actually simplify your deployment mechanisms, because you can put pre-approved parts into that. So, for example, if you need to work with your security team for them to sign off on a particular piece of infrastructure being deployed, so I'm doing containers, and before you can deploy containers, it has to meet these criteria. Instead of that having to then go off to the security team to approve that, if they have a predetermined set of code that they are happy with and they know will run, they now have an approved element that is already interjected into that workflow. And so now that speed that you've gained through doing and taking on infrastructure as code as a philosophy, isn't going to be hindered by them coming up against policy and policy changes. So Sentinel's a great way of, and an enterprise-only feature, but it's a great way of actually simplifying and allowing that trust model that I talked about to really be embraced and allow your automation to be accepted through your organization.
So you mentioned CIS recommendation. So there's a library ready for a CIS on Azure that can allow you to check out the code directly, right?
Yeah, so we recently released our foundations library of Sentinel policies, and so that foundation library is based off of all of the Center for Internet Security best practices, and so we understood, very much like the landing zones, that a lot of cloud practitioners and a lot of cloud adopters are looking for best practices. They want to understand, well, you've been working with this, you understand it. What is the best practice? And so we took a lot of those hard and heavy lifting elements and simplified it by creating a library that you can now adopt and to get going faster. So how do we jumpstart you to a place of confidence, and again, to build that level of trust into your infrastructure deployments?
Very nice. So you mentioned one of the challenges is collaboration, teamwork. So what you guys offer with that thematic?
So now with Terraform Cloud and Terraform Enterprise, and so as we meet those enterprise challenges, we have the ability to actually put permissions and controls around our workspaces. So those individual workspaces that we talked about that control a function. So you have the networking team that has all of the networking component. You have maybe a monitoring team that needs to deploy, and a security team. You can now put SSO and RBAC controls around those individuals so that they only have access to particular runs, they only have access to particular workspaces, and they can only actually change elements that affect them directly. So they can't, and to your point, that limits that overall blast radius. And how do you then again make sure that there's auditing around who's doing what, and make sure that it meets all of your security and compliance. And again, this is all going around how do we build the trust? How do we be able to give the business insight into that to actually then confirm that trust?
All right. I think we could talk about that for hours, David. But as you know, what we really love on this series of webinar is also to show it at work. So let's do a very quick demo and have a view on how to leverage Terraform Cloud to deploy our very own landing zone, manage the state, and deploy that inside TFC. In this demo, we're going to use Terraform 13 on HashiCorp Terraform Cloud to deploy Azure Cloud Adoption Framework landing zone. So we are now on GitHub, where we have our different sample landing zone. And first one is CAF Foundation. That's going to set the foundation for my subscription. And I'm also going to use Hub and Spoke to apply a classic hub and spoke topology, where we have an environment using Azure Firewall, Key Vault, etc., etc. So I'm going to fork this into my Azure DevOps environment, and you can see this is the same exact landing zone I'm going to have, and I'm going to clone that locally in order to be able to edit my environment. So I'm now in Visual Studio Code, and when you are in Visual Studio Code, you can see the different landing zones here. And if we take the example of CAF Foundation, we have our configuration principles and our settings here with this environment. Now we're going to look into a little bit more details on the main config file, and you can see that by default we come with the configuration using Azure Storage as a backend, but we are going to change that now to use Terraform Cloud as a backend. So you see now I'm using app-terraform.io, and I'm going to use the workspace, test, landing zone, CAF foundations. So I already done the login, and now let's just go to Terraform Cloud in order to configure that. So you can see that here I have my different workspace, and I'm going to add a new workspace to specify this configuration. So I'm going to go and select my Azure DevOps environment, but I can use any type of source code environment. I'm going to use Azure Terraform, the repo I just showed you, and I'm going to use TFC here for this particular environment. I'm going to specify advanced option. And for that, I'm going to specify the working directory for the landing zone CAF foundation. And I'm going to specify a specific branch I have, which is TF13. And I'm going to create the workspace. Now, once it's done, I can start and review the configuration. I've configured my variables here to connect to the Azure subscription. And I'm going to select that I'm going to run Terraform 13 inside this execution environment. I'm saving the settings and I'm able to queue my first environment. So now you see that I'm going to deploy foundations. And of course, I'm going to accelerate some of the sections. You see that the plan is being triggered and is running now. You can see the different sections that we're having, and you can see that you need to confirm in order to apply the configuration. So looks good to me. We're going to confirm the plan. So actually the configuration is going to be applied. If we fast forward a little bit, you can see that all the components are being deployed in here as we speak. And here we go. We can configure now the other landing zone, which is the hub and spoke, since this one has finished. So how do we do that? Same thing. I'm going to go into my main, and here you see that I have configured my test landing zone hub and spoke to store my backend. But in Cloud Adoption Framework landing zone, we do service composition. So I'm going to read my test landing zone CAF foundations from one level down into another workspace. And I don't even have to change anything in my code for that to happen. Here I have added my hub and spoke configuration, and same thing. I'm going to just queue a plan for it. And you see that it's going to take a couple of minutes to verify the plan, seeing that I have 44 resources to add. And then I can just do the apply on this environment, confirm that I want to apply all of those settings. And of course, I'm going to fast forward that because it's taking a couple of minutes. And you can see that I can customize and do my composition by using, for instance, here CAF foundation. So as soon as I detect a change inside CAF foundation, then I will trigger a plan also for this hub and spoke environment. So if you do that, you see that foundations applied. I'm applying hub and spoke right now. So let's try to do a change. And I'm going to go into CAF foundation and I'm going to do a very little change. I'm going to change, for instance, here the tags that I'm going to use in my environment. So I'm going to do Terraform TFC. Then I'm going to commit this change into my Git repository inside Azure DevOps. And you see that after a couple of seconds, it's going to detect there's a change. So that's what you see, the planning, cost estimation, and needs confirmation. So if you do that, you see automatically the update tag, the name I used in my commit, is triggered here. And you see that I have this OK update tag. So now I confirm the plan and the apply is going to be queued in my environment. So once I've done that, you can see that I'm applying the change in CAF foundation. And automatically, after it has finished, I will be triggering a plan also inside the hub and spoke environment. So this is what we're seeing here. And we see that the planning operation has started. I can review the changes, and if I'm okay with those, you can see it's just tags. I can just say, okay, update tags. I confirm the plan, then it's going to trigger the run of the configuration. I can go to my Azure subscription, and I can see that I have my public IP, I have my Azure firewall, and you can see that without changing much in my code, I'm able to apply my landing zones for Microsoft Azure using Terraform Cloud and using Terraform 0.13.
All right, David, that was it. A quick demo on how to make the landing zone work on TFC, and that's just the beginning, right? So
something good.
Yep, exactly. So we talk about TFC, and we showed TFC, TFE as well. So it's the same thing running in a private environment, as we mentioned. Can you explain a little bit to us the other components that we could put into the picture here?
So obviously, one of the other things that HashiCorp has built into its cloud operating model is then looking at not just how to build infrastructure, but then how do you manage the elements that are needed within that infrastructure. So we touched on that deployment, and so if you take that one step further and start to look at, well, then how do you do things like secrets management? How do you work that into your application deployment so that you can manage your secrets? And so HashiCorp has Vault that integrates obviously with Azure Vault, which gets really confusing when we're talking about it. But but Vault basically gives you then an API, a single API front end to actually interoperate with from an application perspective. And so now not only are you automating your deployment, but you're automating the ability to get certificates from that, automating the ability to get usernames and passwords dynamically from that. So as you integrate into things such as databases or into your application code, instead of having to hard code things, and again, looking at how you build trust in your code, if there's no usernames or hard coded passwords or any element that is any of use to a bad actor, then you can build trust in that code, because you can put it places and you know that until it runs, it doesn't have any point of compromise in it. And so all of these things HashiCorp are very conscious around how do we tie them together to allow you to adopt your application deployment faster, and therefore move resources into the cloud and take advantage of the cloud a lot faster.
Exactly. So it's all about really standardizing the deployments using battlefield-proven components and methods, and it's ultimately to allow to have enterprise type of reference architecture, enterprise patterns that really can accelerate the adoption of cloud and getting more things faster and with a much more reliable processes. That's what we're all about. So if you want to get started with that, I encourage you to go on aka.ms/tf-landing zones. That's the official Azure repo where you can find all of that. You can watch and star the repo if you want to get notified when we do update, when we publish a new feature. We have monthly release feature. And don't forget, guys, this is a community effort and work, so you can actually submit issues. You can even submit PR if you're okay. If you want to do the fix for the community, that's totally happy to see that. And we're managing that in the open. If you see on this repo, for instance, you have a project and you can see the boards. So that's very interactive and in the open. You can see where we are into the sprints, what we're planning to add at which moment in time, and you can use that, and you can start the deployment on the basic, I would say, vanilla launchpad, or you can use that with TFC and TFE. David, if you want to get started with TFC, TFE, how do we do that?
So TFE, it's contact us as a sales, because that's a traditional deployment, so it's an infrastructure build. But with TFC, you can just go to app.terraform.io. You sign up as a user, and you start to get Terraform. There's a free trial element that you can run and use. There's a 30-day trial which will give you all the bells and whistles, and then after that, there's a free tier that you can use to keep playing with Terraform and keep experiencing Terraform Cloud. But as you see the benefit of things, particularly Sentinel and the control, so you can then move up into those into paid tiers to actually allow you to start using those resources in anger and get the benefits for your organization.
Cool, very nice. So I hope we answered all of your questions. There's still a couple of minutes to interact with us, so don't forget, you can click on contact us and you can have chat, and we can discuss about all the topics that we covered today. So don't hesitate to do that. In the meantime, I want to thank you everyone for joining this session today. Hope it was interesting. And David, I want to thank you a lot for today's session and for the partnership.
Thank you. Thanks for all of the efforts working together, and thanks for answering my awkward questions. It's always a pleasure. Always a pleasure to talk to you, and hopefully this is the start of some really good stuff together. Thank you.
Absolutely. Looking forward to the next session. Thanks to you soon, and see you guys soon.